Hiya, folks. Mr. McGlashan here. We are ready for part 3 of our boom and bust lesson, which is the story of what caused the Great Depression. So, we have covered this stuff here in red. I hope you turned in to part 1 and part 2. But yeah, there was a bunch there. This is mostly about banking and the failure to regulate the banks and the sort of unwise policy of the Federal Reserve. So, we just got a few left. It's a long story. That's why we had a Great Depression. And this is why you are being asked the question, what are the main causes of the Great Depression? What are the most important causes? So, farm-related structural unemployment and the tariff. We've talked about this a bit already. Structural unemployment is when some major change in the economy causes an entire sector of labor to disappear. And basically, the mechanization of farms during the 1920s was causing large numbers of people to lose employment in the farm sector. And then I also told you the story of their demands getting to Hoover, and Hoover deciding that a tariff was the remedy. And of course, that tariff became the biggest tariff hike in U.S. history, and it begins an entire trade war. So, this is a story that I've already told you. You can see it here in this graph, which will be one of your documents in DBQ. So, this is our real story, that trade, overall trade, imports plus exports between the United States and all other countries is, of course, from 1920, 25, 1930 is rising. It shot up during World War II, and it was painful when it shot down. Sorry, World War I. It was painful when it shot down after World War I. But, a roaring economy managed to adjust. This is just mostly with the weapons industry, shipping trade weapons and food into Europe. So, during the 20s, it's rising, though. Rising. And then the very year that the Smoot-Hawley tariff is passed, we have a trade war-induced reduction in trade. Now, to be honest, a lot of this reduction is also due to just to the Depression itself. What caused what? Chicken and the egg. But yes, the trade war kicked it off. Here's a cartoon from the period. Agriculture is looking to get a little tariff to sneak in there. They want to protect their agricultural products, but the big fat pig industries who have deep connections in the Hoover administration, they get all their protection in there. And we lob up a tariff, and Canada hits back. Bam! So, who could have predicted the countries would hit back? Who could have predicted? But there you go. In the midst of a depression, we have a trade war. All right, here's related to add insult to injury to the poor farmers. Right when they're getting clobbered, the worst natural disaster in U.S. history, practically, one of the most terrible natural disasters in our history, literally hits the center of the country. Okay, we get years and years of drought. The worst years it could have been, 1928, 29, 30, 31, 32. And yeah, we get the Dust Bowl. So much of our mental imagery of the Depression is, of course, of the Okies who are leaving the Dust Bowl and coming to California. We here live in Steinbeck country, where, of course, a lot of people came to California in the 1930s because of the Dust Bowl. So terrible misery added upon all the other problems we already had. So the Dust Bowl. Another reason for the Great Depression is the concentration of wealth. And if you look at this graph here, you see that we had an accelerating concentration of wealth in the 1920s. What this graph shows is the percentage of the overall wealth of everyone in the economy that the top 1% has and the top 0.5% has. It's the same thing, the very, very top. What percent of the overall wealth of the economy do they have? And you can see from the 1920s to the 1930s, we have an increasing percentage that the wealth have. This is getting less and less equal until the crash. The crash actually helped bring some degree of equality because the rich lost so much money during the crash. But then the policies that were accompanied with the Great Depression also instituted a period, a long, kind of a glory period during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where we were relatively equal as a nation. In fact, quite uniquely equal as far as societies go. And this was the glory period of the great middle class of America. And sadly, as you can see, wealth concentration is increasing radically since. But why does wealth concentration lead to depression? Well, if the economy is allowing the majority of the money and the wealth of the economy to concentrate in the hands of a few, who will buy the products that the few are selling? Yes, there's your problem, is you need a middle class to stimulate the economy. Starving out the working people and the typical people means you're starving out your customers. So an economy is healthier when more of the proceeds and the benefits of the economy go to the masses because they are consumers. Ford understood this. Ford gave a huge raise to the workers in his factory And he declared publicly that who's going to buy his cars if the very people who work in his factories can't afford his cars? And of course, he encouraged all other businessmen across the industry to do just the same. And so, yes, it is a problem when wealth concentrates in the hands of very few. If you give a billionaire another billion, they don't spend it. If you give a middle-class person $100,000, they spend it immediately. So as far as stimulating the economy, you've got to get wealth into the hands of the masses. Not a complex reason, but there you go. It's one of our many. All right, one of our many causes of war. But another one involves Europe, the rest of the world. Let's blame them. That feels good. I think it was just Britain and France's fault and Germany's fault. But let's look at it. We are part of a globalized economy, and we were then as well. One of the issues that came up that caused the Great Depression was the odd international circle of debt that had been created by World War I. So let's understand it. The Treaty of Versailles, as you all know, required Germany to pay huge amounts of money, about $1 billion a year for 30 years, to Britain and France and Belgium. Huge debt. Britain and France and Belgium owe the United States mountains of dollars after World War I because of all the weapons purchasing. So, Germany owes money to Britain and France. Britain and France owe money to the United States, and nobody's paying. Germany had completely melted down after World War I, and it was in no position to pay any debts or to pay any reparations. And Britain and France just simply said, we cannot afford to pay our World War I debts until Germany pays the reparations to pay for all the damage they did to our economy. And we wallowed in that in the early 1920s. And American banks were struggling because they were not getting what was owed to them. And they had, of course, borrowed on those assets. And there was a clog up in the system. So, Vice President Dawes comes to the rescue. And he goes and negotiates a treaty with the great powers in Europe. And the treaty is comical. It's in 1925. So basically nobody paid anybody anything. We barely got any of the money that was owed to the United States. Germany hadn't paid hardly any reparations. Meanwhile, Hitler's starting to come to power and rise and say, we're never going to pay 1 cent. So the likelihood of Germany paying. But Germany couldn't afford to pay. So what does Dawes propose? It's kind of silly. And it doesn't really work, but it muddles through, that United States investors, the one country that had money at the time was America, and bankers were then allowed to invest into the German economy, which gave some credit to Germany. And the idea was that it would help Germany get off of its feet because it could access loans and credit. And with that, their economy would grow and they'd be able to pay their reparations to France and Britain. And therefore, France and Britain would pay their debts to the United States. Why couldn't the bankers just pay the United States and take everybody else out of the loop? I can't answer that question. But yeah, so basically, all of this was a Band-Aid, the Dawes Plan, and essentially this debt piled up and piled up and piled up and added to all the other debt that everybody owed everybody by the end of the 1920s. And when interest rates started to rise, it turned the whole thing into a shit show. Our Smoot-Hawley tariff actually affected the United States economy largely because it sent all the other economies further into default, and then making it even more clear that we were never going to get paid for all the debt that we got from that we were owed from World War I, which, by the way, we never did get paid because, of course, this catastrophe just went into World War II and all was forgotten. But all right, here you go. So that's the international reason. And we've got one more fatty. All righty, ladies and gentlemen, last but not least, certainly not least, is our cause of the Great Depression, ignoring Keynes. Thou shalt not ignore Keynes. So what Keynes talked about was the importance of fiscal stimulus in an economy. All right, so what we mean by that is one of the things the government can do, we already talked about what the Federal Reserve on behalf of the government can do, and that is to adjust interest rates low to try to stimulate. But another big area that a government can, tool that government can use to stimulate the economy is, of course, their taxes and spending. If you cut people's taxes, then they have more money. And it's a way of stimulating the economy. If you raise government spending, you spend it on the military, you spend it on schools, you spend it on roads, wherever the government spends money, you're throwing money into the economy, giving people jobs. So Keynes understood this, and he suggested that in tough times, what the government should do is spend lots of money. So we're going to go a little deeper into this because Keynes is a godfather of economics. He's probably beyond Marx and and Adam Smith and Malthus and a few others, one of the greatest economists ever to live. And his theories were just coming out right during the Great Depression. And basically, he was ignored throughout the early 1930s until finally FDR started to listen to him. And right around 1937, when we had a second dip in the Great Depression. So Keynesian economics can be boiled down to a simple idea, is that when your country is in a recession, you should have low taxes and high spending. When your country is in an expansion, you should have high taxes and low spending to pay off the debt that you accumulated when you were in recession. Okay, there we go. Fixed up the PowerPoint. We got in recession, you have low taxes and high spending. And then in expansions, when the economy is growing, the private sector is already expanding, then the government can take a step back. You understand? And what they can do is they can run a surplus, and they can then pay off some of the debt that they owed from when they had tough times. So it's a simple idea. I mean, look, I can draw it. An economy goes like this, as everybody knows. Economies go up and they go down, and they go up and they go down. We've all seen markets. That's what they do. And the idea is that these downs are very harsh. Lots of people lose jobs. And so what Keynes basically says is that when the private sector is expanding, the government can pull some money out. So let's say that the economy then, instead of raising so fast, doesn't raise quite as fast because the government is taxing everybody and cutting government spending. But then when the inevitable crash happens, they can then start giving people jobs, government funding, throwing money at the problem, pay one person to dig a ditch and then pay the other person to fill it. It does not matter, but you make the down not so far down. And then when the private sector kicks back, the government can start taxing and spending, and you get a more moderate, easygoing curve. There you go. That's the whole reason. That's the whole idea behind Keynesian economics. And you know what? This is important, so we are going to go another step deeper on this, folks. Get ready for some economics. All right. GDP. I've been throwing that word around. I hope you all understand that GDP is gross domestic product. It is the way that we measure the value of all the goods and services produced in the entire country. So it is our best measure of the overall size of the economy. You want to say GDP per capita? That's the size of the economy per person. All right. Now, economists have an equation that they love that explains GDP. That GDP is a combination of consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and then our trade. The more we export, the better. The more we import, the worse. Okay? And what you end up with is certain percentages of the overall GDP. And the important thing here, the reason I bring this up, is that government is generally, and this is state and local and the federal government, is generally about 18% of the United States economy. So if you're going to look at all the jobs and all the money that is being earned in this country, about 18% of it is from government work. And that is schools, that is transportation, that's the military, it's all of the things that the government does. And that number is adjustable. We can do more during bad times as a government, and we can do less during good times. And that's the simple idea of Keynesian economics, is that when the private sector is not producing, the public sector should. Now, bottom line is during the Depression, nobody, not Hoover, not FDR, was willing to throw money at the problem. And, they increased spending here. You can see this is the overall debt. Sorry. Here we are. This is the U.S. national debt. And what it should look like is in bad times, the debt goes up. And then in good times, we pay off the debt. And then in bad time, the debt goes up. But in good times, we pay off the debt. That's what it should look like. Here's the Depression. The Depression hit right here. And we increased spending, but this is actually late into the 30s when we really ran any kind of deficit. Even FDR, the guy who was, of course, part of the New Deal and did every single possible government program you could think of to try to stimulate us out of the Great Depression, and yet he paid for it by raising taxes. So here it is. That's the problem. And then suddenly our debt spikes. What's that? Well, that's World War II spending, which threw us way into debt. And what do you know? It proved kind of Keynes right, because our economy tore out of depression and everybody became unemployed. In fact, the economy grew so quickly with all that stimulus that even after the war, we were able to pay down our debt significantly. So perhaps we should have listened to Keynes. This is it a little bit closer. What the idea is here, we did not run a major debt during the Great Depression, and we should have. Look what we're doing today. Today, we have the coronavirus hitting us, and we have, of course, the economy crashing, and the United States government is indeed ponying up $1 trillion in fiscal spending. They're dropping interest rates to zero. They're doing everything they possibly can to turn this economy around. And the idea is that they did not during the Depression, not Hoover and not FDR. They both passed what were called revenue acts. They raised taxes on the rich, which is great. They raised tons of taxes, raised taxes. But what they were doing when they did that was pulling money out of the economy. And according to Keynesian economics, they shouldn't have. And it was only when we listened to him that came out of the Depression. All right, folks. Hoover's the president. Let's blame him. Yeah, you guys, Hoover was president for a solid 3 years of this Depression, and you can't say that he didn't do anything. He, in fact, passed some legitimate reconstruction efforts, emergency relief. He did an agricultural act that tried to help farmers. The Revenue Act, though, there you go. That's the one where he raised taxes because he did not want to run a deficit. There's Andrew Mellon on the side saying, no deficits. We must have our house in order just as every American must have their house in order. I understand, but when the economy is falling through the floor, you can have a little government stimulus, and then when the economy rises, you pay off the debt that you earned. All right. Hoover's biggest mistake is the way he spoke. He just talked about how we need some rugged individualism, that volunteerism will pull us out of this mess. We cannot have totalitarian socialism. All the rhetoric of the laissez-faire conservatism of the Republican presidents of the 1920s came back to haunt them. Americans were in no mood to hear it's not the government's job to fix their problems, when 25% of the people are actively looking for work, able-bodied and unemployed. They wanted to be put to work. So Hoovervilles in every city. All right, there's this, you can look around, all the pictures of the Great Depression. It's no fooling, real misery in the Depression. We've never seen anything like 25% unemployment since then. Okay, a story that just epitomizes the rejection of Hoover's response by the American people is the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army were World War I vets who were hard hit during the Depression, and they had been told after World War I that they had pensions coming and that they were going to get bonuses. All soldiers who fought in World War I were told that they were going to get generous bonuses, and a lot of these bonuses were going to kick in over time. They were supposed to get some in 1928, and they were supposed to get some later, but I think a lot of them weren't going to kick in until they were older, until the 1940s. And when the Depression hit, they said, we want them now. They were desperate, and so the thousands of World War I vets descended on Washington, demanding early payment of their bonuses. And the nation was on their side, to be honest. They had fought hard and risked their lives in World War I. And yeah, here's the story. They occupied Washington for several months. They demanded their cash that they were owed. They protested. They chanted. There were labor unions there. There were socialists there, but mostly these were World War I vets just demanding what was promised to them, and it got ugly. Hoover ordered in the National Guard, the Marines. It was actually Douglas MacArthur who led the expulsion of all the vets from Washington, D.C., and it went down. The cops came in, the soldiers came in, and the vets fought back. And all these scenes are shown across America on newsreel and all across the radio. And it did not make Hoover look good, because there he was shooting at World War I vets who were just desperate and poor, like so many Americans were. Blame it all on Hoover. Some say that Hoover gets a bad rap, but the bottom line is he just kept talking about what the government can't do. And in the midst of the worst depression of a nation's history, people want to hear what the government can do. An unlikely man steps in to replace Hoover. FDR is one of our most incredible presidents. He was an intellectual, aristocratic man who found that microphone and ran with it. But in 1932, he clobbered Hoover because, of course, Americans felt that Hoover was not responding to the Depression. They wouldn't have named them Hoovervilles as a compliment. And FDR brings the Democratic Party to its glory. It finally, for once, is no longer just a Southern party. In fact, they nominate a fairly progressive man, FDR, even on race, and forever changing the Democratic Party. And then FDR steps in and basically says, it's not what we're going to do. We're doing it all, everything. And he produces what's called the New Deal. And this is the subject of another lesson. But just to be quick, Under FDR and large Democratic majorities in Congress, they embrace a very progressive agenda, and they embrace everything that I've just taught you about what caused the Great Depression. We get an Emergency Banking Act. We get a Securities and Exchange Act that creates the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the heck out of Wall Street. I already told you about Glass-Steagall that they enact. Then the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guarantees all of our bank accounts, the FDIC, and makes it so that you don't have to run and panic when the economy is crumbling, that your life savings has disappeared, because the federal government guarantees our life savings. And then you get the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is basically the McNary-Hagen bill that the farmers had always dreamed of, but it's a massive government involvement in the agricultural economy. We get the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration. This is why they called the New Deal alphabet soup. But the bottom line is that under FDR, the government steps up and embraces its responsibility and its duty to handle it when the private sector collapses. So, ladies and gentlemen, FDR gets 4 terms, crushing in 36, crushing in 1940, and then crushing again in 1944. Something about World War II affected our understandings of FDR, of course. But the bottom line is we have finished our long list. Next week, you'll get documents, and you'll be given a short amount of time to tell me what caused the Great Depression using documents. Here's our question. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope this didn't get long. You're not bored, are you? How could you be bored? What else do you have to do? You're stuck at home. Coronavirus holiday. Anyway, have a good weekend, folks.